Hi everyone, fantastic to be here in Melbourne tonight. And we've got a very special guest on the line. We've got Professor Jonathan Sharples joining us from the Education Endowment Foundation over there in London tonight. So fantastic to have him on board. He's the lead author on the effective use of teaching assistants article, which is really the basis of all this work. So fantastic to have him with us. Also, as you can see to my right, we have Susanna Schofield, who is the Associate Director who's leading up our work with the guidance reports. So very excited to have Susanna with us as well. But wait, there's more. We still have Dr. Pauline Ho in the room as well. She won't poke her head on the camera, but you can rest assured she is in the room. She'll be on our chat box tonight. So I encourage you all to use our chat box throughout tonight and put your questions into the question and answer box so we can keep a close eye on that and answer as we go, and also hold some over until the end as well. So excitedly, we have registrations from across Australia. Every single state and territory are joining us tonight. And we've got system leaders, we've got school leaders, we've got teachers, and most importantly, I think, but I have a strong bias, we have teaching assistants in the room with us here tonight. I have a bias because my husband is a teaching assistant, just calling that out early on, okay? We've got the bias out of the room. All right, let's jump straight on in, people.
And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet in Melbourne, the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, acknowledging that there are, as Tanya said, people joining us from all over Australia, and extending our respects to the traditional owners of the land on which you're meeting tonight.
Beautiful.
So we're going to move into a little bit of context of what we understand teaching assistants in Australia to look like, a little bit general, but Tanya's going to go into a little bit of the detail around this. This comes from a Teacher Magazine article that Tanya wrote recently, and I'll pass over to Tanya.
Thanks, Susanna. So we know that there's a really sizable workforce in Australia. So we have on average 10 teaching assistants in every school, but as we know, the average does not really let us know the detail behind that. We have over 92,000 teaching assistants employed in Australia schools, and this is seen to increase to over 114,000 in 2022. So quite a few years from now, but we see it to be a really growing and useful workforce that we really want to draw on as thoughtfully as possible. So we have 26% of those are full-time, and the average age is 46, and predominantly we have a female workforce, although my husband is an exception to that rule, and I'm sure there are many exceptions to that rule. All right, so what we do have in Australia is that we don't have any common qualification. We do have some that are qualified with either, and the highest predominant qualification is either a Cert 3 or a Cert 4. So that represents over 37% of the teaching assistant population has that qualification. And then we have 10% with a bachelor degree, and just a little over 7% that have a postgraduate qualification. And if you'd like to read more about that type of information, there's the link to the article there, and we'll be releasing the slides as we always do. So what we're going to do, just to start off with as an evidence base, we're going to start off with our teaching and learning toolkit. So what that provides for us is sort of a gateway into evidence-informed decision-making and an introduction to educational research. We have our average month's worth of learning progress. This is a translation of the effect size. We have our security of impact, which is the number of padlocks. So the greater number of padlocks, the higher security of the evidence. I've heard Sir Kevin Collins, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jonathan, call those handbags. Sometimes people call them handbags. Have you heard him say that as well?
Yep.
But we're not calling them handbags tonight. We're calling them padlocks. And we also have the cost to implement as well. So what we're going to do, we're going to jump on to the Evidence for Learning site and just have a quick walkthrough of the toolkit there. So if we jump on the toolkits, yeah, and as you can see, we just a couple of months ago released our early childhood education toolkit, which was exciting. But today we're going to the Teaching and Learning Toolkit. We're going full approaches, all approaches, full toolkit, and then we're going to jump on, and I'm doing this quickly because really the main event today is Professor Sharples. So what we have here, we have our what is it, how effective is it, how secure is the evidence, what are the costs, and what should I consider. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on here. This is a resource that you can go to at any time. So it has a relatively high cost, a lowish evidence security and low months of impact, but Professor Sharples will be talking to the variety that sits underneath that months of impact that we can see there. Probably my favourite bit of the toolkit, well, this is my second favourite bit of the toolkit, is the what should I consider section. It really gives you that practical information of turning evidence into action in your classroom, but even more practical than that are the guidance reports. What we have here also are our references, and this lets us know where the effect size is being calculated from. So there are our effect sizes there, and there is the effect size there that's been calculated from all those different studies. What we also have in our version of the toolkit is the Australasian research summaries, and here they are here. These are produced by Melbourne Graduate School of Education by Janet Clinton's group, headed up by the Centre for Program Evaluation out of Melbourne Uni, and they summarise all the research for the past 6 years in Australia in regards to teaching assistants. And we have had this also added to, and we do welcome academics to write in and add to that section as they would like to. So that is a starting point for looking at the information regarding teaching assistants. And we will just jump through now. And I'll throw over to Professor Sharples.
Hi everyone.
Slide.
Let's see the chatting at 9 o'clock in the morning to across Australia. So yes, thanks for taking the time to join. Yeah, so I've been leading our work at the Education Endowment Foundation around TA deployment for the last, I guess, sort of 5 years now, and it's an area that's there's quite a lot of nuance in the evidence around teaching assistant deployment, and I guess one of the things we always say around the teaching and learning toolkit is we encourage people to get beyond the surface level into the detail, because often that's where the interesting and more actionable information is. And that principle is really relevant when we're looking at this evidence around teaching assistants, because although that average effect that we just looked at there talks about a relatively small effect, I think it's about +1 additional months progress on average. When you look underneath that average, you see that there's quite a varied range of effects, studies that look at that produce a range of different effects around TAs used in the classroom, and there's almost a kind of polarized picture. So on one hand, the evidence would suggest that particularly when TAs are used in a general classroom environment in a reasonably unstructured way and aren't supported particularly well, the evidence would suggest that they even actually can have a negative impact on pupil outcomes. But on the other side, there's evidence getting stronger all the time that when TAs are used appropriately, trained appropriately, deployed so that they build on what we're trying to do in the lessons, there's pretty good evidence that the TAs will have a positive impact on pupil outcomes as well. So that average effect that you see hides a much more interesting kind of polarized position. And we'll talk through some of that evidence in a bit more detail. And this kind of graph illustrates that. So you've got this really wide range of effects on the bottom here. In some cases, zero effects, and even actually some negative effects. But then on the other side, you've got some large effects, particularly around when TAs are delivering really high quality structured interventions. So we were really interested in this because there's clearly a possibility there, to do something different than we were doing already. And there's some real signs of promise that that wasn't really filtering through to a conversation with schools, certainly in the UK, but I imagine more widely. So yeah, it's an area that kind of led us to doing this more focused guidance on making best use of teaching assistants.
Great, thank you, Jonathan.
So this guidance report was March 2015 was almost like a first attempt to get off the fence, if you like, on an issue and try and give some more practical, clear and actionable guidance that went further than the toolkit into a set of recommendations that seemed to emerge when you looked at the evidence on a kind of practical topic. And this was the first one we did on teaching assistants, but there are about a dozen now covering all sorts of different things: behaviour, literacy, numeracy. I encourage you to go and take a look at those as well. But really, I wrote this with a couple of guys, Rob Webster and Peter Blatchford at University College London, who have long-standing researchers in this area, and we reviewed the evidence around teaching assistant deployment. Really, one of the kind of key things that came out of this is that the evidence, the situation around effective and less effective TA deployment was not anything to do with, certainly wasn't the fault of teaching assistants. It was an issue that related to a leadership issue related to how TAs were being trained, deployed, used, and within the kind of school context. And often the weaknesses were just not really down to a kind of thoughtful, careful use of this really significant workforce. On the other side, the positive signs that we could see is when TAs were being used and trained and deployed effectively. So it's a really key issue, that this report is called Making Best Use of Teaching Assistants. It's about how schools, teachers, leadership teams can maximise the use of the TAs. There's some work we'll talk about which is more, it's very relevant for TAs, but we really want to emphasise that this is really intended for schools, teachers, to really think about how they're maximising the use of the teaching assistants. There is work we'll talk about which is really relevant for TAs' practice and is really useful to help support their work in thinking about how they work with kids on a day-to-day basis. But that work only gets traction if the background environment is effective and you've got schools really thinking carefully about how they use TAs.
So this is really where our work has come in. As Jonathan has highlighted, this is work that we've described for an audience that is around school leadership and teachers, those people that make decisions around deployment, because that is a really strong linchpin of the success of teacher assistants in Australia. So the summary of recommendations is pulled from the E4L update for this guidance report. There's been a lot of work in contextualising the original EEF document to make it relevant to Australia, but still hold the essence of the recommendations and the evidence base that has come from the UK, but is also an international evidence base. There's a number of people here in Australia who have helped us to work through the nuance of this. I'll shout out to a few people because I know they're on the line and they've been invaluable critical friends and contributors. So Leanne Hillman from Bolster Education in New South Wales, and also Matt and Natasha from Statewide Services Division at the WA Department of Education have been terrific through this process. We're really lucky to have the great IP and the work that's already been done from the EEF. And we hope that the translation, which you'll be seeing released in the next couple of weeks, will be really valuable to schools in Australia and have enough context while still maintaining the rigour of the evidence. we've called this as well, making best use of teaching assistants. That's really what it's talking about. And these 7 recommendations, Jonathan's going to go a little bit deeper into throughout our webinar today. But we really hope that translation of these evidence pieces, these resources, is going to allow educators in Australia to use evidence more thoughtfully and in a better way. So Jonathan, I'll hand back to you to have a look at these recommendations.
Sure, yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, just at this level here, I guess the thing to point out on this slide is that there are these 7 recommendations, but they kind of fall into 3 groupings. So the first 4 relate to the kind of everyday use of TAs in kind of general classroom environments. The next 2, the 5th and 6th one, talk about the use of TAs in terms of delivering specific interventions. They can be in the class, but they're often typically outside of the classroom, interventions around catching up on literacy, numeracy, or other things as well. And then the last recommendation, which is sometimes overlooked, talks about how you link the learning between those 2 environments. So a pupil could be doing some really productive work with a TA out of class, but it's important to try and help that pupil make the link back to what they're doing back in the general classroom environment. So if they're using a particular maths technique in a catch-up intervention, is the teacher and the TA are making sure that work is kind of transferable back to what they're doing back in the classroom. So that's kind of step 1, about integrating between the 2 contexts. Can you forward the slides? Can I do that, Tanya? Or do you... Yeah, so these are taken actually. I think these are taken from our original. The colours are back to the ones in the original guidance report. But so when we started looking at the research around how TAs were often being deployed, certainly in the UK, but also internationally, I think this is reasonably kind of consistent, is that there'd been this kind of gradual drift for teaching assistants increasingly taking on the role for kind of a primary educator for pupils that were typically lower attaining or had special education needs. So there was a big study called the Deployment Impact of Support Staff, the DIS project, and it ran for 10 years here in the UK, but they also looked at evidence internationally on this. And what they were finding is that gradually in the UK, TAs were finding themselves acting often as the main teacher for these kind of groups. And although that might be well-meaning, the idea was to give more support to these groups. What was going on is it was creating a whole range of separation kind of effects. So typically these pupils were separated sometimes from the curriculum. They were being taught a different thing. They were being separated from their kind of peers, so they weren't often interacting with other pupils in the classroom in the kind of same way. And probably most importantly, they were being actually separated from the teacher themselves. So when they looked at the time that the teacher was spending with these pupils, it was often a lot lower than it was with the rest of the class. So it was almost, you're getting a situation where in the kind of worst case scenarios, the teacher was sort of outsourcing the teaching of these pupils to the teaching assistants. And this is certainly not something that the TAs were looking for, but the evidence would suggest that these separations, the separation from the teacher, the curriculum, the peers, that this was associated with significantly lower learning outcomes. So in the studies that we're seeing a little effect or even a negative effect, this seemed to be the real driving kind of cause of it. So really the first recommendation is to not do that. It's kind of like to sort of turn it on its head and try and avoid thinking about TAs as a kind of informal, almost sort of teaching resource for low attaining pupils, and take a wider view of how TAs can support learning. And then the kind of next recommendation is almost the kind of the natural follow-on from that, which is what does seem to be effective is, and is a kind of broader a broader view of how TAs are deployed in the classroom. I was saying this to Tanya when we were just talking about the slides before. Really, this guidance report boils down to one really cross-cutting principle, which is that we should think about how we use TAs to supplement but not replace teachers in the classroom. And to a certain extent, that is this guidance report, actually. And the 7 recommendations are either different manifestations of that principle or ways to get to that kind of principle. And I hope we'll see that, I think, as we kind of run through it. So really, what we're trying to do is broaden the view of how TAs were being used in the classroom, and yeah, find ways in which they can work potentially with low attaining pupils in a way that helps them engage with the teaching and the curriculum in the lesson. So it's kind of, sometimes people talked about this kind of Velcro model of TA deployment, where you might get a TA kind of like stuck to a pupil or a group of pupils. So perhaps, you know, one way of thinking about this is moving from a kind of Velcro model to an elastic band. So we've got a kind of, yeah, a less tight assignment of TAs to pupils. And when you do that, you find all sorts of interesting, kind of exciting ways in which TAs can play a role in the classroom. You know, it might involve, for example, a teaching assistant having a more visible role at the front of the lesson, working with a teacher in a, you know, they might be working together. The teacher might be leading out a piece of work. The TA might be collecting answers from the classroom. They might be kind of, you know, coming back and picking up on responses and kind of encouraging further elaboration of things. They might, sometimes they may be playing a role where they'll be working with a group of low attainer pupils, but their work with them won't be about doing something at a different set of teaching. It will be helping them access the teaching and learning that's going on in the general classroom. So they might, for example, be helping them refocus on the task, or making sure they're in it, that they're ready to engage with the lesson, or that if they didn't quite catch something, that they're helped with that understanding of that. But instead of standing between the pupil and the teacher, or the pupil and the lesson, they're kind of standing behind the pupil, metaphorically, and helping them access the teacher in the lesson. So it's a kind of, it's pretty nuanced stuff, this is actually, you're seeing more the teacher's role as kind of supplementing what you're generally trying to achieve in the kind of classroom. And you know, one of the markers of this that you should see is that teachers, when this is going on, should be working with low attaining pupils and pupils with special education needs just as much with any other pupils in the classroom. So, you know, you could, for example, have the teaching assistant working with the higher attaining pupils for a period, or rotating around, you know, you could rotate around different groups over the course of a week, or, you know, a whole range of different kind of models. And, you know, we've got things to share on some of those different models of TA kind of deployment. Yeah, that's the kind of, and that is the key kind of principle. So, yeah, so this slide kind of captures that. So what doesn't seem to work is where you've got the TA acting as the kind of, you know, in that inner circle there around the pupils, and to a certain extent kind of insulating the pupil from the access to the teaching and the learning. And what we're trying to do is flick that round. The teacher should be, to a large extent, the primary point of contact with all the pupils, and the TA is thinking about how the TA is deployed and trained in a way that they can provide support. I think one of the things we've learned, actually, it's really helpful, and we'd encourage the school to give time for the teacher and the TA to work out their complementary but differentiated roles here. It's almost like kind of, we use this analogy of learning like to dance, or learning a dance, you know, like you need to know the relative moves in your kind of dance, you know, so that you're not standing on each other's toes. So, Yeah, and it takes time to do that, and when you've got a really amazing partnership going on in a lesson, it looks like a dance. The teacher will go and work with one group of children, the TA will then kind of spot that and move back, and kind of, it's beautiful, and I'm sure we've all seen examples of where you see these really dynamic, fluid partnerships in lessons where they're changing as the lesson kind of goes on. But that takes, to really set that up, you've got to give the time and the effort to encourage people to work out what their complementary roles are. And we've got some resources. We've got a teacher TA kind of agreement template that can help teachers and TAs work out some of those complementary roles. So there's some resources that we can share in relation to that. This slide is just another way of kind of illustrating that. I guess, yeah, it's a similar kind of way really, which is perhaps what's been going on is that the responsibility for low attaining SEN pupils has been kind of handed, too much onto TAs. They've been left often working with the kids with the most complex learning needs without sufficient support. And it's about rebalancing that kind of role of responsibility. And as I say, the only way this doesn't happen without the involvement and the kind of role of leadership in. To a certain extent, the difficult about this issue is that it requires also teaching to teachers and addressing some of the assumptions with teachers about why TAs are there, in the classroom. And it can be convenient for some teachers to have a teaching assistant keeping, naughty little Billy busy in the corner while they're able to, carry on and teach the rest of the lesson. And we've had some quite frank conversations with teachers about, well, that's not the role of a TA, isn't to kind of, to babysit the naughty kids. They need to be an integral part of the lessons, and we need to think it's not fair on the TAs either. They've been left with the support training, working with difficult pupils. So even though that's a very quite clear and obvious principle, to actually implement that requires some tough work, actually, some hard work at a leadership level to readdress some of the assumptions of why teacher TAs are there, what they're for, how to be used. So it's quite, and the reason I have to kind of emphasize this, actually, I know we might flick through some of the other slides faster, but if you get that principle right around supplement, not replace the teacher, the rest of this becomes easy. If you truly understand that principle across the school, then everything else just becomes a kind of, and if you can get that really kind of embedded within the mindsets and work of teachers, then all the rest becomes kind of straightforward, I think. Yeah. I won't talk about the next one. This one, the next recommendation is about more TAs kind of practice in lessons, and what the research says about how what TAs kind of interact with pupils, and what we can do to improve that, and some of the opportunities out of that. But in a kind of in really kind of brief terms, the evidence would suggest that it's not just TAs, it's teachers actually, but we all tend to try and offer too much help too quickly when we're working with pupils, and TAs potentially can do that even more so. So they tend to want to help the pupils get things right, perhaps sometimes a bit quicker than they should. And really, the evidence would say here is about try and think about what's the least amount of help that's needed first, and then try and encourage pupils to take more ownership of the tasks, and then gradually introduce support and help as they kind of need it. So I think if you flick onto the next slide, Tanya. Yeah, so what the practices that seem less effective are things like, completing tasks for pupils, not allowing them time to kind of think and respond, kind of over prompting and over kind of spoon feeding. Again, often these are really well intended, but they can, over time, if this happens for a long period, you get to a point where the pupil almost sort of yeah, you know, just sort of transfers their learning to the TA to a certain extent and outsources it. And kids are very good at, of course, about learning the dark arts of working out just how, you know, little or much they need to do to get someone else to help them, right? So over time they can work out just, oh, well, you know, if I'm stuck, you know, then the people can help too quickly. So it's about trying to encourage pupils to be comfortable taking risks, to be comfortable with being stuck. That's inherently part of learning, and thinking about encouraging the right amount of support in, you know, as and when it's needed. I think there's another slide. The next slide is, yeah, this has been I wish I had had this when I was teaching, by the way. It's really useful, I think, for everyone, this, but and it's a kind of a scaffolding framework that runs through, that kind of can be useful to help think about what is the least amount of help at the right kind of time. And basically, as you move down that kind of arrow, you're offering more explicit, direct kind of help. Basically, you're providing more support right to the point at the end where you're giving the answer. You're kind of correcting and actually providing the kind of answer. Mm-hmm. But really, what this is suggesting that should be the last case scenario, really. And at the start, the first thing you're doing is trying to do is kind of encourage. Firstly, just encourage the pupils just to have a go themselves, and if they don't have any idea of how to answer it, perhaps giving a kind of prompt back to a previous bit of learning, or, you know, you'll know that they have done this before, they'll be aware of it. So you're just trying to kind of give them a couple of kind of, you know, very kind of light touch prompts to have a go, give a bit of encouragement. Then if they're stuck, you might give a bit of clues. So, you know, well, remember we've looked at this in this kind of way. Are there any ways in which you could, you know, go about doing this particular exercise? Then if they're still kind of struggling with it, then you might model it out. Well, if it was me, I would go about this question perhaps by thinking about this way or that way. And then, you know, only then really, then, you know, if by that point they're still struggling, you might say, well, okay, well, in this case, look, here's how I would do this exercise. I'll show you. And then you have a go on the next one. But typically, if you follow this kind of framework, you rarely get to a point where you actually, you know, actually kind of correcting. So they kind of try and encourage metacognition. They're trying to encourage pupils to think and plan and make some decisions around how they're kind of going about tasks, which is just a good thing anyway. Yeah, of course. Yeah. I don't normally promote books, but especially, but I think these two are worth looking at, because these. So Rob Webster and Peter Blatchford wrote this guidance report with us, and the Maximising the Impact of Teaching Assistants book is the kind of full fat version of this guidance report, and you'll get a really deep look at TA deployment through that. And then the book on the right there is a very deep dive into more the practice of teaching assistants, this stuff we've just been touching on then. What do we know about how TAs interact with pupils, and what are some of the ways in which we can move those on? So there, you know, if you're really interested in digging into deeper with these, then I would certainly, you know, they'd be worth having a look if people have seen this before. Okay, so let's just sort of summarize. So we said to think about how we use TAs to supplement, not replace teachers. We need to try and develop our practice of around how we work with pupils in the classroom. It's relevant for TAs. I think it's relevant for everyone. But to do that, you need to understand the complementary but differentiated roles that we're going to play in the classroom environment. Well, the only way you can do that, it's not going to happen by magic. So if you've got a scenario where teaching assistants are not part of the school training, really to any deep extent, not often, you know, fitting into the whole staff kind of development or appraisal process, then that then you're not going to be able to develop these kind of complementary understandings. You're not going to be able to upskill TAs and teachers. Crucially, you know, teachers need training on how to work with TAs. You know, you can get a situation where you can get a newly qualified teacher working with a very experienced teaching assistant, you know, and it's very quite daunting for a teacher who's not really been given any help or support on how to work with that TA. So you can't develop these complementary roles unless you give some time to work those out. So you need some. This recommendation is saying that we need to ensure TAs, and I would say teachers, are fully prepared for how they're going to roll in their classroom. So there's a kind of training point here, but there's also you can't also do that. TAs can't supplement or really build on what we're trying to do in the lessons if they don't know what's going on in the lessons. So there's also a more kind of day-to-day liaison point here. And one of the things that came through the research is that TAs are often feel as though they're going into lessons blind. They're not really fully aware of the objectives, either, you know, fully of the lesson, of what really, you know, is required of them, what their, you know, there are specific roles or tasks or objectives that they can play to build on. And a lot of the time they were, you know, going into lessons, again, often being working with kids with most complex learning needs. And really, you know, it's a very, very difficult scenario to be put in that. And so really this is saying that we have to, time obviously is the most precious commodity in schools, but we've got to carve out sufficient time to enable TAs to be able to kind of prepare either for lessons and brief afterwards. I guess one of the things that I've learned on this is that initially you'll need more time often to do that liaison. You'll need more time to work out what you need to be doing in lessons and to feedback. But as you get a teacher and TA partnership over time, get to know their complementary roles, the amount of time that you need to talk before and after lessons goes less and less and less. And I wouldn't start with this, but I know examples of where the briefing before the lesson will be a 1 minute kind of conversation with a post-it note, hand it, because they'll know exactly what their longer term kind of objectives are. So that because they've spent time investing to work out their complementary roles more broadly, they might be meeting, you know, a couple of times a term to really bottom that out. It means that day-to-day interactions can be really efficient and kind of brief. So, you know, there are obviously lots of ways in which we can communicate electronically now. We can kind of, you know, they're enabled, but the will has to be there. Like you have to have the will there to be able to update TAs and make sure that they're moving into these lessons with enough insights to be able to contribute effectively. And so, yeah. So I'm just rabbiting on here, by the way.
Sure, it's fantastic rabbiting, Jonathan.
Do you want to have a pause, or do you want to?
Sorry?
You want to have a pause, or should we keep going?
I think we'll keep going, if that's all right.
Yeah, keep going. Yeah, okay.
Unless do you want to pause?
No. I'll chat all day.
No, it's going great. Thank you.
So yeah, so here we go. So here's one way of sort of summarising this. So this is not everything, but this is some of the stuff from the Teaching and Learning Toolkit plotted in terms of impact at the left-hand side and cost on the axis on the bottom there. And so what you see here is that, you know, teaching assistants are down here, reasonably expensive without having a huge impact. But if you look at the things up on the left-hand side here, they tend to be pedagogies. You know, they tend to be things like providing really effective feedback in lessons. So one way in which we can kind of see this possibility is, well, TAs are down here on the right, but how can we use them to support these really high impact, high effective strategies up on the left-hand side? What's the appropriate role that TAs could play, for example, in giving feedback or collecting feedback in the lessons? Maybe they can act as they can provide a role because they're in the classroom, they're wandering around, they can learn, they can collect some really in the moment information about how children are learning, and then they can relay that back to the teachers, and then they can, you know, they can have a really productive conversation around, you know, feedback and formative assessment, for example. So I think that's kind of one way of sort of visualizing this. Okay, so that's on the general classroom stuff. The next section is, as I say, on TAs delivering kind of interventions. And actually this is, so, you know, research is frustrating and is often ambiguous and doesn't point, you know, often in this consistent directions. But this is one area that certainly from the EF, you know, we've funded 150 randomized trials now, and this is one area where we're seeing the most consistent positive results. So is when we're evaluating teaching assistants delivering highly structured, really focused interventions, often around literacy and numeracy, but we've done a whole range of things actually. You know, they're used to help kids that are struggling in some aspects of their learning in a really kind of focused way. Yeah, so catch-up numeracy and catch-up literacy were two examples of this. Very kind of, not how short they are. These are 15-minute sessions, which is often a characteristic of these effective interventions. They're brief, really well structured, almost sort of planned out to the nearest kind of minute or so. They have to be for 15 minutes. You know, you haven't got time for a long introduction. Mm-hmm. And because they're brief, you can tuck these in, you know, around in bits of the school day that really don't then remove these kids out from the lesson. So you can do them in some kind of, you know, in really kind of efficient ways. And we did a couple of trials of this, and it had an impact on pupil outcomes in numeracy and literacy. Just fix the next slide, Tanya. Actually, I think it's the one. Just go to the one afterwards, please. And then, yeah, this one, yeah. And this table summarizes. We've actually got more than this now, but this summarizes some of the interventions that these are teaching assistant-led interventions, and this is everything from kind of early years interventions around developing oral language, right through to interventions that have been used in secondary schools to help kids that was, you know, needed to catch up with their literacy so that they're able to access the secondary curriculum. And if you look at the second column from the right there, that's a very unusual, consistent set of results. So typically these interventions are showing effect sizes between 0.2 and 0.3, you know, at least 3 additional months progress compared to the kind of control groups. So, you know, so if anyone says your TAs don't have an impact in the classroom, this is what to show them, because, you know, when, but it goes back to how they're being kind of used. So if you flick back to the one before, you know, so the one, yeah, the one after one, Tanya, please, that one, yeah, thanks. So this is a really kind of clear, positive message. So that given the right support and training, kind of key point here, TAs can make a significant contribution around delivering interventions, but those effects are only observed in structured settings with high quality support and training. So often when we were comparing these interventions, we're not comparing them to schools doing no interventions with TAs. We're often comparing them to schools doing loads of interventions. It's just that they're not trained, they're not specific, they're not being implemented in a kind of sharp, consistent kind of way. And actually, you know, that when they're done in those ways, it can negatively impact. So the take-home message here is not use TAs to deliver interventions. It's how they're being used to deliver the interventions and the support. So we would recommend, you know, look for some of these evidence-based programs, or if you can't find one of these programs, at least trying to capture the characteristics that they provide. So if you flick forward to, yeah, so back to that one, yeah. So I think the kind of key messages here are brief, regular, and sustained. So short sessions, you know, with a kind of rhythm to them. So often you'd see interventions, you know, people would not do them for a couple of weeks, or they would kind of, you know, so there's something about the, yeah, brief, regular, and then over a reasonable amount of time. And to do that they need timetabling, of course. Extensive training, way more than probably you imagine, actually. And this is not just relevant for TAs, it's relevant for everyone, actually. You know, we don't train us in schools. And it's not just the upfront training, it's the follow-on support after the training to help people, you know, why we assume that just by training someone in a room that they'll be able to do it. It's, you know, we don't learn like that as adults, do we? We don't learn an instrument or a sport like that. So you need to provide some follow-on coaching and support and feedback to help people to be able to apply the stuff that they've learned in training into their practice. Having really good structured resources and lesson plans seem to help. You know, if you've only got a 15-minute intervention, then spending 5 minutes to kind of find your notes is just not enough. So having kind of real precise, detailed kind of plans really helps on this. And a common feature of a lot of these projects is that often have really high quality assessments to either making sure that you're identifying the right pupils, finding exactly where their areas for improvement were, tracking their progress, and hopefully showing that they've improved so that they don't need the interventions. And you can then, so often regular high quality assessments were woven through them as well. So, you know, if you can't get one of these evidence-based interventions, at least try and make sure that the things that you are doing are kind of capturing some of those kind of features. Yeah, flick that one, please. Yeah, and there are these kind of resources that we've created. Like this is again, these are all we can share all these, but there's like an interventions health check where there's a series of questions that you can use to ask and sort of, you know, examine some of the different interventions that you might be using. Yeah, click to the next one, please. Yeah, so just to kind of tie up, I mean, where this with interventions is, I think that it's better to do fewer interventions well, rather than doing, you know, loads of interventions kind of poorly, and thinking about carefully choosing. So remember what I was saying, that this report is this one principle, which is use TAs to supplement, not replace teachers. The use of interventions really illustrates that. So the effective use of interventions involves selecting some really well-chosen interventions that extend and build on what you're trying to do in the classroom. So they're not disjointed, they're not kind of random, disconnected things. And that they're done in a way that really carefully integrates with your objectives in the general classroom environment. And also involves effort to make sure that the pupils can make their learning back to what they're doing in the general classroom environment. So that principle about using TAs to supplement, not replace teachers, is perfectly illustrated by the effective use of interventions. You know, poor use of interventions is where schools are taking kids out for big chunks of the day, doing something that's completely disconnected what they're doing in the lesson, and they're out, they're being kept busy, but they're not they're not really, you know, making the learning that the rest of the class are. So. Okay, how long have we got left? Oh God, I've done that quick.
All good.
All good, yeah. And then as I say, it's don't make the assumption that the pupils can then naturally link across between these two environments. And, you know, again, this comes back to that recommendation around liaison. Is that just having some carefully, you don't need a lot of time, but just scheduling time every kind of fortnight, just to be able to have the TA can give a progress update of how that pupil's going in that intervention. The teacher can then start thinking about, well, right, how can I build on that back in what we're doing in the lesson? So again, you can't do that unless there's some contact and structured dialogue to enable that to go on. Okay. Right. So if the evidence is quite straightforward, which I think it actually is, the changes are not. So I guess I've worked with about 1,000 schools now, probably on this now over the years, and I really enjoy it as a topic to work with schools on, because it's a really kind of complex set of conditions that often has led to the situation, and to get it right requires changes across the school. So yeah, I'm sure you wouldn't underestimate the challenge, but actually, if the evidence is, if we're trying to get TAs to supplement, not replace teachers, to do that requires changes from the leadership. It requires working with teachers. It requires working with the special education needs coordinator. It requires working with the TAs, and it can require changing mindsets, changing structures of how. It requires a HR issue sometimes. It requires changing timetables. It goes deep actually, and so it be easy on yourself as you're making kind of these changes. Yeah, and the recommendations are a kind of foundation, but they will look different in different environments. So, in an inner city large secondary school, these principles and practices will look different than they will, of course, in a small rural primary school. But it's going to play out kind of differently. But the same ideas, I think, apply, across kind of different contexts. So it's up to you to think about how they manifest in your environment. If flick to next one, please. Yeah. So there's no kind of right way or wrong way to go about these changes, but we found that it's if you say, right, okay, we want to really address this, it's helped. Some kind of structured process seems to help support that. I think the first thing to do is try and understand where you're at in relation to TA deployment and have a kind of real thorough dive and review or audit, or whatever you want to call it, and of kind of current practices. And yeah, so that's about taking stock and being honest and really listening to different people and how they feel practices are working. Then from there, moving on to having a really kind of clear vision of what you want to achieve, and getting down and getting a shared vision as well. It's not just a kind of it's held at leadership. You've got a real clear articulation of what you're trying to move towards and what you're trying to get to. Then you start to kind of convert that into a set of more practical practices. Well, this is going to mean, we're going to do it in this way, or we're going to try and adopt these approaches, and then getting on and actually, delivering that and setting up a schedule for training for. And this is typically schools will spend a year, if not longer, working on this as a kind of gradual process, alongside other things, of course. But it's worth taking kind of time. Just flick to the. I can't remember what's the next slide now. Yeah, you flip one on, Tanya, please, and I'll just see if there's. And then one more, please. No, okay, just go back actually then to where the one with the cycle, please. Sorry, a minute. Yeah, so no, so the one with the cycle, yeah. So, if you're going to go about this process, a few things that I would perhaps recommend. Don't try and do it across the whole school initially. Set out, try and perhaps get a team of people, set up an implementation team or a working group that has representatives from across the school. So this has worked consistently well, is where you set up a group of maybe 3 or 4 people or half a dozen people that with a representative leadership team, perhaps a middle leader, SENCO, special education needs coordinator, teacher and a TA, and set them the tasks for overseeing this kind of process. Set them, the jobs for doing some reviews of current practice, of lead it out kind of slowly, if you like. And that seems to work well, rather than trying to take on the whole, because there'll be lots of things you'll have to deal with. And it seems better that you use a kind of pilot group, if you like, to kind of scope out some of the changes, perhaps. So, yeah. The other thing that I would recommend is really do this review process. If you just flick to the next, Tanya. Yeah, and there are a whole range of kind of tools and resources that you can access that we've made available to help you do that. So, so if you actually flick onto the next slide, there's, for example, a red, amber, green self-assessment document, which for each of the recommendations in the report has some hopefully quite vivid descriptions of what good, really effective, developing and poor, ineffective practices look like in relation to these recommendations. And these have been collected from case studies over the years, and a lot of work putting this together actually. And this document, I think, is one of the things that people have found most useful. So if you're going through a review process, try and benchmark where you are in relation to some of these statements. And if you really want to push yourself, don't try and benchmark what proportion don't just kind of say, oh, we're all red, we're all orange, we're all green. Try and say what proportion of staff, or try and work out, where is your green really good practice, where is it weaker, and and revisit it over time and kind of keep coming back to it. But there's a whole range of stuff on here. We've got kind of anonymized questionnaires that you can use with staff to kind of elicit kind of understandings. There's a whole pack of stuff. There's an online course that's available. So there's a whole stack of stuff that's there. 5 minutes. Oh, crikey, look at that. It's an hour.
Quickest hour ever, Professor Sharples. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us tonight. It was very engaging, as we can see by the amount of people that stay consistently on the webinar. So thank you. Especially thank you for all the analogies that you used. They were incredibly useful in breaking down what things really meant. You could see your teaching skills come to the fore there, Professor Sharples. So thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you to all the educators, for all the leaders, system leaders, the TAs for joining us tonight, giving up an hour of your time to find out more about how to really effectively use teaching assistants. If you want to join us for other webinars, I think next time we'll be talking all things parental engagement. And connect with us on social media or sign up to our newsletter for updates. If you've got any comments and feedback on this webinar specifically, reach out to Susanna. So we'll wrap up for tonight. Thank you for your time again, Professor Sharples, and thank to all you wonderful educators for taking your time to educate yourselves about teaching assistants. Have a great night, and Sharples, have a great day.
Will do. Thanks.
All right,
Bye.
thank you. Bye.